Denis Villeneuve is a French-Canadian filmmaker who kind of came out of nowhere in the early 2010s, very quickly rising the ranks to become one of the decade's most successful and critically acclaimed directors. A graduate from the University of Quebec in Montreal, Villeneuve began his filmmaking career writing and directing a couple of low-budget dramas, which while certainly showed potential, were not at the level Villeneuve believed he was capable of, causing the man to take a 9-year sabbatical as a stay-at-home dad, vowing to only return to filmmaking once he was ready to make something he could truly be proud of. Just under a decade later, Villeneuve fulfilled this promise, releasing a string of pretty great thrillers before moving on to make some pretty great science fiction. In fact, these films were considered so pretty great that in 2019, the Hollywood Critics Association awarded Villeneuve the Filmmaker of the Decade award. A pretty big statement to make, but honestly, I can't really fault them. This guy is easily one of the most exciting directors to emerge in the last 15 years, and with his new film Dune Part 2 having just been released, I thought now would be the perfect time to rank all of his films, in this week's edition of everyone's favourite series, Worst to Best. Just a quick warning, this list is completely my own opinion, so if you disagree, comment below what your ranking would be. Anyway, let us begin with... So we've spoken a lot about debut features in this series, and just how much they vary in terms of what exactly they're bringing to the table. Yes, in terms of quality, but also with how much of the director's flair and style is present from the beginning. And when it comes to August 32nd on Earth, the first film Denis Villeneuve ever made, I'd say that this is a pretty standard debut. From the beginning, you can really tell that Villeneuve has a ton of confidence behind the camera, but this confidence never goes into that level of arrogance or pretentiousness that you often see in debut features or student films. No, the shots throughout this thing actually feel really mature, the standout being the scene set in the desert, which contains some truly stunning cinematography. It really reminded me of Fargo, which had come out only 2 years before this. As for the story of this movie, it's definitely one of Villeneuve's most human and down-to-earth, but if we're being honest, it's pretty thin. We have a model who wants to have a baby with her best friend to give her life some meaning, and of course with that comes complications, and you can probably guess what happens. This film doesn't really have that gripping sense of unpredictability which Villeneuve's later movies seem to pull off so effortlessly, or that is, at least not until the final few minutes, with an ending that does actually completely come out of nowhere, but not necessarily in a way which I would argue works particularly well. It just kind of felt like Villeneuve threw it in at the last second for some extra pathos. But anyway, August 32nd on Earth, it's a decent piece of work. It certainly gives a glimpse as to what Villeneuve is capable of, but to be honest, it's not something I can ever see myself revisiting. So, Polytechnique was the first film Villeneuve made after his 9-year sabbatical, and is the type of movie I often really find difficult to talk about. If you didn't know, this film is a dramatization of the 1989 Montreal Massacre, which was a university mass shooting where an unstable misogynist murdered 14 women with a semi-automatic rifle, injuring another 14 people. It goes without saying that this is Villeneuve's bleakest film, his hardest watch, and a piece of work which has really torn me, as movies around this subject always do. But before we get into the meat of why this is, let's just get the more obvious stuff out of the way first. Polytechnique is well made, it's well acted, I like that it doesn't overstay its welcome, and there is a small part of me who thinks that stories such as this one being dramatized is a good thing, that we should try to show and confront these very real tragedies which we usually only hear about and try to push to the back of our heads, in order to raise awareness and build empathy. And yeah, I do kind of get it. It is a horrible film to watch, but that is kind of the point. Yet, there is another part of me who does find the whole thing a little exploitative, if we're being honest. It's the kind of film which leaves a bad taste in my mouth, but not necessarily for the right reasons. First of all, I find it kind of bizarre that a film about the devastating actions of a hateful misogynist, a film about a massacre whose anniversary in Canada is commemorated as the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women, does not really attempt to characterize any of the female victims. Not really. The main two characters in this movie are one of the male students reacting to the attack, and the killer himself, whose violence, which is all shown to us here in a clear, brutal, and sobering fashion, does not seem to really serve any purpose other than to shock and entertain and make us gasp. Even the way the film is structured, immediately showing us a glimpse of the shooting before going back to the start of the day, appears to me as Villeneuve extorting and playfully editing around a real tragedy that actually happened, in order to build suspense and thrills for his, in comparison, very unimportant movie. At least something like Gus Van Sant's Elephant, while definitely inspired by the 1999 Columbine High School massacre, does not explicitly claim to be a reenactment of those events. And look, part of me wants to scathe Villeneuve for all this, but first of all, I do think his heart was in the right place when making this, and second of all, I do just feel like this is a wall you're inevitably going to run into whenever you're making a film with this subject matter. Maybe it's just me, perhaps I'm just always going to see this type of thing as exploitative no matter how you present it, and to be fair, this is one of those movies which really seems to split people, you know. Its Letterboxd review page is just 5 star, 1 star, 5 star, 1 star. But yeah, I'm gonna leave it there. I've put this ahead of August 32nd on Earth just because the filmmaking here is clearly much more refined than his debut, but honestly, I know which one I'd rather watch again. Maelstrom is Denis Villeneuve's sophomore effort, made 2 years after August 32nd on Earth, and is in my opinion a big step up from the director, not least just because I feel like the moral complexities he was attempting to go for in his debut are just completely blown out of the water here. In just the first 15 minutes of this movie, we are privy to an abortion, a hit and run, and a talking fish, who appears sporadically throughout the film as its narrator, constantly being gutted and beheaded only to miraculously appear again to continue the narration. It's definitely my favourite aspect of this movie. It's one of those truly bizarre decisions which just somehow completely works and elevates the story, you know? And we're gonna be seeing these bold decisions time and time again throughout this video, as fortunately for us viewers, Denis Villeneuve just is that guy. Because look, if we're being honest, Maelstrom is one of those stories which, on the surface, is kind of simple, and which perhaps another filmmaker would have made something pretty bland and forgettable out of. Yet, in the hands of someone like Denis Villeneuve, even a Denis Villeneuve who is 1, nowhere near his peak, and 2, who clearly did not have much money or resources to work with, he is able to deliver a truly wicked, cheeky, weird, and darkly funny kind of tragicomedy, which is easily one of my personal favourite genres. Don't get me wrong, Maelstrom is definitely a flawed film. It's not paced particularly well, and the tone is sort of all over the place, which is often the case with these types of stories. However, I cannot help but just admire the audacity of something like this, especially the more philosophical and surreal aspects, which do kind of overshadow the actual story the film is trying to tell. Honestly, I just really appreciate Villeneuve's brand of surrealism, and I wish it was something he explored a little more in his filmography. Like, I would love to see the fish from this film sort of caught in this endless cycle of life and death. I don't know, return to narrate Dune Part 3? Although, to be fair, from what I know about the Dune Messiah book, that story has enough weirdness in it already. Anyway, speaking of surrealism, let's move on to the next film, which probably holds the title for Villeneuve's single weirdest and most ambiguous piece of work. I feel like Enemy is often kind of forgotten about when it comes to Denis Villeneuve's filmography, perhaps because it is overshadowed by another film he released in 2013 starring Jake Gyllenhaal. Yet while this does not reach the heights of Prisoners, a film we will be talking about in a bit, this is still a pretty intriguing and surreal thriller, which, much like David Fincher's Fight Club or Richard Ayoade's, in my opinion, superior The Double, revolves around a doppelganger plot which sort of seems to break the laws of reality, which we already know and love. And don't get me wrong, making a film with a story like this can definitely be a risky path to go down. Like I said, it's not the most original idea in the world, and it can at times feel a bit trite. It's actually a plot point made fun of multiple times by Charlie Kaufman in Adaptation. Yet with Enemy, I do feel like Denis Villeneuve is able to justify its existence by essentially going all in on the genre's more surreal aspects, relying far less on explaining to the audience why this is happening, why there are two Jake Gyllenhaals, and much more on symbolism and metaphor. Enemy is one of those really ambiguous pieces of work that is not really just going to serve up any of the answers you may want on a silver platter. It is easily one of Villeneuve's most cerebral and allegorical movies, and if you by chance want an explanation as to what on earth actually happens throughout this film, it's one of those cases where you're gonna have to go on the internet, because this thing isn't really gonna give you any easy answers. And while some people, including the guy talking to you right now, really enjoys movies like that, I do think Villeneuve is the type of director who thrives when working with a slightly more meatier script, you know? Don't get me wrong, I love the surreal stuff. I've already mentioned that I would really like to see him revisit the sort of rule-breaking strangeness he exhibited in films like Maelstrom and indeed Enemy. However, I also do just prefer Villeneuve when he's able to bring a bit more to the table, when he has a bit longer of a runtime to really let the story stretch its legs, to really let the audience breathe in the atmosphere. Overall, Enemy for me is a well-made, solid 90-minute psychological thriller, of course boosted by a terrific performance from Jake Gyllenhaal, who really is just an excellent actor, and we'll talk about him more in a bit. It definitely unnerves, it definitely succeeds in getting under your skin and making you think, especially with that bizarre ending, which I won't spoil here. But let's just say it's not a film which really tortures me long after the credits roll, like some of Villeneuve's other, perhaps more large-scale thrillers. Alright, so I can imagine that this is probably going to be the most controversial placement on this list, but let me just try and explain myself. 2016's Arrival was an incredibly important turning point in the career of Denis Villeneuve, as it marked the man's transition into the realm of science fiction, which I personally believe to be his best genre. When later asked why he had suddenly turned away from grounded mid-budget dramas and thrillers in favour of science fiction, Villeneuve said, "I didn't turn to science fiction, I went away from it." This is a guy who clearly was always incredibly passionate and knowledgeable about sci-fi. In a recent Letterboxd interview, he put Blade Runner, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind among his all-time favourite films, and he is, in my opinion, one of the genre's greatest ever storytellers. In fact, despite only helming at the time of writing 4 science fiction movies, I don't think it would be an outrageous statement to crown Villeneuve the greatest science fiction director of all time, ahead of people like James Cameron, Christopher Nolan, and even Ridley Scott. And while I would definitely claim Arrival to be the weakest of his forays into the genre so far, make no mistake, this is still an incredibly unique and intriguing movie, and its placement here just speaks to the incredible quality of this guy's filmography. But anyway, here's my deal with Arrival. I think as an alien film, if you will, this thing completely excels. The angle it goes for, being not about fighting the aliens, but instead trying to communicate with them, trying to learn their language, bringing in Amy Adams as this expert linguist. It's a really clever and refreshing approach to a genre which at times can feel kind of stale. This is also a film which is just a technical marvel. This is something I'll get into more when discussing his other science fiction movies, but Villeneuve is genuinely a master when it comes to atmosphere. I really get the impression that it's one of his priorities in the filmmaking process, and it's something that he dedicates a lot of his films' runtimes to. There is so much here in Arrival just about the pure terror of extraterrestrial beings landing on our soil, but also the huge sense of excitement and curiosity of why they could possibly be here, what they could possibly gift to humanity, and this is emphasized by both an incredibly powerful and emotional score from Johan Johansson and excellent lingering cinematography from Bradford Young. Villeneuve is one of those directors who really is able to bring in the right people and get the most out of them. You know, this thing really is a tour de force in filmmaking, and it all creates this tone which does feel really alien and strange in a way I don't think is present in most other films about this kind of subject. And I guess the last person I'll give praise to is Amy Adams, who here just gives a performance which I feel like at this point is pretty iconic and has been lauded by just about everyone, except for the Academy, of course, but we don't care about those guys. So overall, I do think Arrival is a very strong piece of work, which is really bringing something new to the genre. I guess my biggest flaw is that I feel like it just slightly trips up on itself near the end, when it, in my opinion, starts to feel less like an intelligent and precise Denis Villeneuve picture, and more like your typical Christopher Nolan timey-wimey extravaganza. Not that I inherently dislike what Arrival does in its final act, but to me personally, the retroactive emotional core of the film does not hit me as hard as I think the film wants to, if that makes sense. Now, lots of people who've seen this film say the complete opposite, that they found the ending really powerful, and that's completely fair enough. Again, I actually don't mind it at all. I think it's good. But to me it's just a tiny bit cliche, especially when compared to all the other aspects of the movie which feel so fresh and unique and perfectly executed. I hope that makes sense. Once again, I do think Arrival is a really solid addition to the science fiction canon. It's just not, in my opinion, on the same level as Villeneuve's other odysseys into the genre. Also, Jeremy Renner is surprisingly believable as a theoretical physicist, so fair play, Jeremy Renner. So, Sicario was the only one of Villeneuve's more, famous English language embedded in the cultural zeitgeist films that I had not seen before making this video. In fact, I literally only watched this thing for the first time a few days ago, and I'll be honest, I was initially going to talk about this film a little bit earlier on in the video, declaring it an incredibly well-made movie, however containing a script that left a lot to be desired. But these past few days, I've had some more time to really think about Sicario a bit more. I've watched quite a few really well-made video essays on the movie, and I have now come to the opinion that this is a pretty great film all across the board. And I think we should start off by talking about something I haven't mentioned yet in this video. It's something which sets Denis Villeneuve apart from all the other directors we've discussed in this series so far, and that is the fact that he's only actually penned about half of the films he's directed, them being his first 4 French language movies, as well as Dune and Dune Part 2, which is obviously a pretty big deal when it comes to discussing the guy's filmography, but this is especially the case when it comes to a film like Sicario, which was written by Taylor Sheridan, a man usually more known for his gritty westerns and who isn't exactly the first person that comes to mind when asking, hey, who should Denis Villeneuve collaborate with? And I mean no disrespect there, I loved Hell or High Water and the guy came across really well when he went on Joe Rogan, but I guess all I'm trying to say is that they don't exactly seem like two artists who would have particularly similar creative visions. But I guess with Sicario, Denis Villeneuve is once again really able to show off his versatility as he adapts a script which is as brutal as it is deceptively clever into an incredibly tense and nihilistic thriller about the illegal drug trade and, how do I put this, the levels of savagery there are in such an already wicked environment. Because at the start of this film, we're introduced to Emily Blunt's character, who is clearly very competent at her job. Compared to any normal person, she's a badass. We get this incredible scene at the American-Mexican border where they have to extradite this cartel guy, really tense, and we're seeing it all through the eyes of Emily Blunt, and it completely leads us to think that the film is about her. But throughout the rest of this movie, we begin to realize that this isn't really the case, that both the advertisements and the film itself have sort of played a trick on us, and it's all just executed so well. I won't get into any more spoilers in case you haven't seen it, but if you have, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Like I said, at first I wasn't really sure if I liked this writing decision, and I was originally going to come on here and claim that the film's screenplay is by far its weakest aspect, and that perhaps in the hands of a lesser director, this would have been just a very standard tale of the illegal drug trade. But I do now see the nuance of Sheridan's script, even if it was allegedly changed quite a bit during the filming. For example, Benicio del Toro basically decided for himself that his character should talk way less than what was written in the screenplay, instead basically relying on just looks and movements, and oh my god was this a brilliant decision. He easily gives one of the best single performances in Villeneuve's entire filmography, and honestly, one of the most memorable characters I've seen in a really long time. He's just scary. But yeah, overall Sicario is a rock-solid, brutal thriller which I think is bringing, much like Arrival, something really different and unique to its genre. There are still some small grievances I have with its screenplay. I wish Sheridan got rid of some of his more obvious Hollywood lines, like when Del Toro is saying, "Oh, this is the land of the wolves, and you're not a wolf, and I'm a wolf, but you're not." I was like, okay, I get it. You don't need to spell it out. But these moments are far and few between, and are completely made up for by the expert pacing, editing, and of course cinematography from Roger Deakins, who is not only the greatest cinematographer of all time, but also one of Villeneuve's best collaborators. And this artistic harmony is even more impressive in the next film on this list. So, Prisoners is not a film that I would usually like that much. I know there is a very big audience for these dark, gritty thrillers centered around death and violence and where it's always raining, but it's just never really been my thing, you know? I guess the best way I could put it is that my favourite David Fincher film is not Zodiac or Seven. No, it's The Social Network. It's the Facebook movie. However, when it comes to a film like Prisoners, you can't help but just be in complete awe in how perfectly executed everything about it is. Despite this not being number one on my ranking, I think if I had to prove to someone with one film just how incredible of a director Denis Villeneuve is, I'd probably show them Prisoners. But the funny thing is that I do kind of think about Prisoners in the same way I initially thought about Sicario, in that I do believe the screenplay to be the film's weakest aspect. But does this not just prove my point even more? Is it not even more impressive that Villeneuve was able to take a really good script, don't get me wrong, but elevate it to something truly masterful? Because I would honestly claim that every other aspect of this movie, which of course Villeneuve is going to have huge influence over, is 10 out of 10 perfection, no notes, you know? This is some of the best cinematography of Roger Deakins' career. It's not as flashy as something like Blade Runner 2049, or Skyfall, or 1917, but his ice-cold framing and agonizingly slow and methodical zooms are such an excellent foil to the absolute chaos of the story which it's capturing. And Deakins is second only to Mr. Jake Gyllenhaal, who here gives another one of the best performances in any of Villeneuve's films. He can stand proudly on the same podium as Benicio del Toro in Sicario. He's so convincing as this troubled detective who is genuinely really good at his job. I love seeing competence in films. It's like one of my things. People who are just good at what they do, people who are passionate and have a strong sense of justice, is just always so compelling. But he also has this inner turmoil about him, like he keeps on doing this twitch with his eyes. It's a really small detail, but it's stuff like this which is actually able to build a lot of character and really makes him feel more human. You know, he's vulnerable. As is Hugh Jackman, who is also really strong here. In fact, I do think this is the best performance of his career. And that's the thing with Prisoners. Everyone working on this film was just clearly at the top of their game. The performances, the editing, the cinematography, the way Villeneuve is able to build such suspense. It's all able to elevate what could have been just, you know, your standard thriller into a really strong piece of work. Not my favorite genre of film, not my favorite type of movie, but something that I really respect. So, like I mentioned in my original video on Dune Part 2, I'm a really big fan of this franchise. But what I didn't mention was actually how I got into the Dune series. See, soon after hearing that Denis Villeneuve was adapting Frank Herbert's classic science fiction novel, I actually found a copy of the book just lying around somewhere. I can't remember exactly what happened, but I'm pretty sure I just saw this big book in the middle of the street somewhere. There was no one around, and I guess it was fate, because I started reading it and ended up really enjoying the story. Yes, for its epic blend of science fiction and fantasy, but also for just how strange and psychedelic it was. I was actually pretty surprised that what I was reading was one of the highest selling sci-fi books of all time, or that Denis Villeneuve was able to get the green light on a big budget adaptation with such an unusual source material, especially considering that David Lynch's Dune, made like 36 years earlier, had underperformed so heavily at the box office, leading many people to believe that the story was simply unfilmable. Well, Denis Villeneuve's Dune finally came out in 2021, and was actually the first, and at the time of writing, only film I saw 3 times in the cinema. I instantly thought that this film was a masterpiece, and upon finally rewatching it last week in preparation for Dune Part 2, I can completely see why. First of all, this is, in my opinion, such a faithful and respectful adaptation of Frank Herbert's original novel, or at least the first half. Yes, there are changes, there are scenes removed and scenes added in, but this is always going to be the case when adapting such a large story, and I haven't seen too many complaints online, even from die-hard Dune fans. However, what Villeneuve is able to nail, and which is in my opinion far more important, is the feel and atmosphere of the book. This is a guy who clearly is so knowledgeable and passionate about the original source material, and the way he brings the world to life here is just so impressive, and honestly puts most other Hollywood adaptations to shame. I also think the way Dune deals with exposition is really impressive. This world is set like 8,000 years in the future, it's incredibly different from our own, and lots had to be explained. And I just think the way that information is transferred to the audience through dialogue and the odd more heavy-handed exposition scene is really well done. It never feels obvious or like it's slowing the story down. And of course, all of Villeneuve's technical execution is present here. This is easily one of the best looking films that have come out in a very long time. Yes, in terms of Greg Fraser's cinematography, the guy is quickly becoming one of the best DPs in the industry, but also in terms of the effects. It's how I imagine people felt when they went to see the original Star Wars in 1977, you know? There is not one single frame in either of these Dune films which looks fake. There is not one moment of dodgy green screen or whatever, which takes me out of the experience. And it's made even more impressive when you realise just how big everything is. Villeneuve absolutely nailed the original novel's sense of scale, whether it's the spaceships or the worms or the pageantry of these houses. This really does feel like such a real world. It's so convincing, and I think a lot of the credit here does have to go to Frank Herbert. The cultures he created back in the 60s feel so tangible. All the stuff with the Fremen especially, with everything about water, it's just... yes. This is how you build a believable world. And honestly, you'd think Frank Herbert was still alive and on set with just how respectful this adaptation is. As for the cast, we'll talk about it more when discussing part 2, but honestly, I think this cast is so perfect, but the guy who steals this first film for me is probably Jason Momoa as Duncan Idaho. He just has so much swagger and charm, but also this deep sense of loyalty and respect, and that scene in the hallway, man. I'm not gonna say anything more than that, but it's probably my favourite moment in the whole film. I just live for stuff like that. I guess I only have one flaw with the first Dune, and to be honest, it has become even more apparent now that the second one is out, and that is that at times, this really does feel like a prologue. And look, I completely understand that this story could not have been told properly in one movie, unless it was like 5 hours. But when you compare this to Dune Part 2, it does kind of feel tiny in comparison. A lot of it is set up and introducing us to this world, and that's fine because it's so well made, but let's just say that it doesn't exactly stand on its own as much as something like the original Star Wars or the Fellowship of the Ring. I also find the ending of this film to be a little on the nose. Clearly the people making Dune were slightly worried about making enough money to justify a sequel, and it's almost like the final 5 minutes are just dedicated to promising people more. But it can feel a bit strange, especially as now the second one is out. Zendaya saying, "This is just the beginning," is kind of the one moment in the movie which I feel like is just not subtle at all, and it does sort of take you out of the experience a bit, because it's basically the film just breaking the fourth wall, and I don't think it works. Although, again, I don't understand why it was done. But let's just say if I was doing my own edit where I had to combine these two Dune movies into one 5-hour epic, I would definitely cut it. But yeah, I still stand by that this is an excellent film, and I just realised I haven't even mentioned the score from Hans Zimmer yet, which is honestly one of my favourite scores ever. It is truly a spiritual experience to listen to this thing. Herald of the Change, bro? Herald of the Change? My soul leaves my body every time. I don't even know where to begin with this one, guys. I saw Nsondy for the first time a few days ago in preparation for this video, and I'm still kind of speechless by the whole experience. Watching this film honestly created a new emotion within me. I think this is what they call drama with a capital D. Because look, I'd heard about Insondi a lot before watching it. I'd seen a few of the reviews on Letterboxd saying stuff like, this is one of those movies that forces you to sit in silence for an hour after watching it. And there's before you watch Insondi, and then there's after. And I was like, yeah, whatever, let me put this on so I can talk about it in this video, but let's be honest, I'm more here for the sci-fi and thrillers. And then I watched it, and nothing will ever be the same again. To be honest, I don't really want to talk about this film too much. This is the kind of thing you just need to see with as little information as possible. I mean, when I pressed play, I didn't even know what it was about, what story it was telling, and I think that's the best way to go. With most movies, to be honest, but especially with something like Insondi. Yes, this is a very well-made film. The way it cuts between past and present is done with such delicacy. The way the story unfolds is just tragically beautiful. The central performance from Lubna Azabal, I hope I got that right, is incredible, and I'll be honest with you guys, there is one moment in this film which I don't think I will ever forget. It fully shocked me to my core, and that is all I'm going to say on the matter. Please, please watch this film if you haven't. It is one of the most memorable experiences I've had with a piece of art in a while. But anyway, enough of that. Let's talk about another worm movie. Dune Part 2 is simply one of the coolest films of all time. I've obviously already made like a 10-minute video about this movie, so I'll try and keep this short. However, I just rewatched this masterpiece in IMAX, and man, I liked it even more this time around. First of all, everything I said about Dune 1 is true here. This is, on a technical level, simply one of the most impressive films that has ever been released. I don't really have any notes when it comes to any of that stuff. The pacing, the editing, the cinematography, the effects, the music. I would just not change anything about this movie. It's one of those very rare pieces of work where you just cannot fault a single cut, a single shot, a single line. This feels like an even more impressive adaptation of Herbert's novel than the first Dune, because look, the first Dune is incredible, we've already spoken about this. But the first half of the Dune novel is definitely more tame than the second half in comparison. The first half of Frank Herbert's original book is a lot of politics and setup and introducing us to this universe. And like I already said, Villeneuve adapts the story really well. However, it's only with the second half of the novel where things get really religious and weird and psychedelic and much more difficult to adapt. But if anything, Villeneuve does an even better job here. Yes, once again, things are changed from the book, even more so than the first film, but honestly, I don't have a problem with any of them. In fact, now this second movie is out, I can safely say that I think Villeneuve's Dune is superior to Frank Herbert's. Maybe that's controversial, maybe I'll get cancelled by hardcore Dune fans there, but I don't know, man, it's just how I feel. This is such a breathtaking deconstruction of myth and faith and the hero's journey. It is one of the best sequels of all time, and it is all topped off by, in my opinion, a pretty perfect performance from Timothée Chalamet. And to think I heard whispers before this film came out of Chalamet. The kid's a star, man. He is so good in this film, and I think he's finally proven to the world that he is not just a guy who can play gloomy white boys with bad posture, but actually a really impressive actor with a lot of range. The film is awesome, it's awesome, and I feel like it's one of those things where I'm only going to appreciate it more and more as time goes on. It really does feel like we are witnessing history, but because it is still so fresh, because the hype has not yet died down, I cannot confidently put it ahead of our number one, but honestly, it was really close. Okay, so quick history lesson. I honestly believe the original Blade Runner to be one of the greatest films ever made, but this wasn't always the case. See, my first experience with Blade Runner was the theatrical cut. Boo. It's the version with a ton of voiceover, which really takes away a lot of the movie's subtlety, and also has a really bizarre and cheesy ending which famously used footage from The Shining's opening. And I really did not like it at all. I thought it was a waste of time. So when I went to see Blade Runner 2049 for the first time in the cinema, I was not yet a cyberpunk convert, if you will, and thought that the film was pretty forgettable. Although I was like 16, 17 at the time, so that probably explains a lot. Anyway, eventually like a year later, I started to get the urge to rewatch the original Blade Runner. This time round, I saw the final cut, and about 5 minutes in, I was like, oh, okay. This is one of the best films ever made, got it. And then I thought, hold on, it has a sequel. So I watched 2049 again and thought, that was okay. Then I saw it again and thought that it was pretty decent, and basically I just kept on watching both of these Blade Runner films until I got to the point where I'm at now, where I basically think that they're two of the best science fiction movies ever made. Don't get me wrong, I still think that the 1982 Blade Runner is the superior piece of work. I mean, honestly, it would be in my top 5 films ever made, but I do understand the people who believe 2049 to be better, and for that reason alone, I feel like it has to be crowned the best movie Denis Villeneuve has made so far. In many ways, Blade Runner 2049 is very similar to Dune Part 2. This is incredibly respectful to its original source material, because I remember when this movie was announced and so many people thought that it was going to be like the Marvelization of Blade Runner, that it was going to be your standard Hollywood sequel which would introduce a new cinematic universe with 15 different spin-offs. And I don't exactly think the posters and trailers helped with this either. And then the film actually dropped, and it turned out to basically be, as Denis Villeneuve put it, an art house film with a $150 million budget, which was not only a faithful sequel to the 1982 Blade Runner, but a movie which actually built upon the world Philip K. Dick and Ridley Scott had originally built. 2049 is its own contained film which is telling a new story, but it is also simultaneously linking to and improving the original Blade Runner, keeping the mysteries in that film a mystery, all the while building on what it had initially set up with the characters of Deckard and Rachel. This is what every single sequel should strive to be. But even on its own, I mean, forget the original Blade Runner for a second, just consider 2049 as its own thing. It's an exceptional piece of work. Just like the Dune films, Villeneuve is proving that even in this new era of blockbusters, where everything just feels like a rushed green screen first draft mess pushed out by greedy executives, you can make beautiful, high-budget pieces of art. I mean, let's be honest. It's pretty embarrassing when you compare 2049 and the two Dune films to like 95% of the other blockbusters that are coming out these days. I don't exactly know how Villeneuve is convincing the studios to greenlight these types of projects, especially considering Blade Runner 2049 famously didn't even make its money back, but I'm not complaining. It just genuinely feels like a miracle that something this special was made. There's that review on Letterboxd which is like, when Batista said, "You've never seen a miracle," he was talking to the audience because they hadn't seen this movie yet. And honestly, yeah, that's completely true. People really like to focus in on the cinematography from Roger Deakins here. Of course, the original Blade Runner is one of the most beautiful looking movies ever made, and its sequel is no different. But I almost feel like at times it can overshadow the other elements of Blade Runner 2049, which are in my opinion just as strong. We are of course here getting stunning visual effects. It's that perfect blend between practical and computer-generated imagery, which Villeneuve always seems to nail. This is also a beautifully edited film. There's this one moment near the end where Ryan Gosling is sat by a fire, and we see the cinders kind of rising up, and the camera starts to turn, and bang, it's Los Angeles again, and the music just goes blah. It's honestly one of the most visually impressive things I've seen in a movie. I probably watch this transition every few days, to be honest. But let's face it, we all know how excellent this film is technically. What truly stood out for me here, however, on this most recent rewatch, was actually the story and the character of Kay. I'm going to be getting into some spoilers here. I'm assuming you've seen this film though. I mean, who hasn't? But anyway, I really love the deconstruction of the hero's journey here. Again, it's very similar to Dune Part 2, although of course in a completely different way. I just think that there's so much truth to Kay's character. The way he starts to believe that this story being told is really about him, before all those dreams just being crushed right in front of him, and ending with him realizing that while the story isn't his own, there is still a difference he can make. It's powerful stuff, man, and a really fresh and unique character arc. And I'm not gonna lie, the first few times I watched this, I didn't really like the fake Ana de Armas girlfriend thing. I thought it was a pretty overdone sci-fi trope in a film which was otherwise it's so different to everything else in the genre, you know? We've seen this kind of thing so much in movies like Her or Ex Machina, and I don't know, I was never a fan of it. Well, now I actually think it's one of 2049's strongest aspects, as it ties into Kay's character arc so well. That scene with the hologram is honestly one of the most powerful moments in science fiction history, and when she calls him Joe and he just has that dead stare, it is simultaneously so heartbreaking but also very inspiring. The way he realizes that his whole life has been a lie, but in that realization he is finally free to do something which is real and meaningful, it's all just exceptionally executed. You know, just talking about the movie has made me want to watch it again. I reckon it is one of the best films to have been released in the last, I don't know, 10 years. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, Jared Leto, people clown on this guy, and yeah, sure, whatever, but he is honestly absolutely perfect as this cyberpunk Bond villain, with just the right amount of ridiculousness, and yeah, I think that's gonna be it. Honestly, I could talk about the top 4 to 5 films on this list all day, but we gotta stop somewhere. I got stuff to do, man. I gotta watch all these masterpieces again. Denis Villeneuve, hands down one of the best directors of the 21st century, and I cannot wait to see what the guy does next. Please let me know your own rankings in the comments section, let me know what director you'd like to see me do next, and I will see you in the next one.